Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. The last private jet has taken off, the last chauffeur-driven limousine has stopped idling, and Greta Thunberg has held her final rally. The UN climate change conference known as COP26 in Glasgow has wrapped up, and many of the 40,000 delegates and participants are still unsure if it was a success. Many delegates feel that the agreed deal didn't go far enough to achieve its intended goal, keeping the world at under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. Now, if I sound a little negative on this conference, it's because I've attended my fair share of UN conferences, and in my experience, many delegates seem totally out of touch with reality. Simply put, oftentimes it seems that a small group of out-of-touch international elites who are driven by ideology rather than reality are driving the narrative for the rest of the world. Even Greta Thunberg slammed the COP26 conference as a PR event. So what was decided upon? Well, there were many big declarations, such as 133 nations signing an agreement to end deforestation by 2030, or India pledging carbon neutrality by 2070. Even a groundbreaking pledge, albeit limited, was signed to phase down coal and fossil fuels. A framework was even developed for the trading of carbon credits. But do any agreements from COP26 have any teeth? Is Canada harming its economy and natural resource development sector with new restrictions on emissions, while other countries get off scot-free? And the biggest question of all, are we actually in a climate crisis? Well, joining me now to help us unpack it all is Dan McTeague, former Liberal MP and president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. Dan, welcome. I hope you've been taking in the interesting conversations at COP26.
A lot of interesting conversations. I would certainly hope that someday they can actually be rooted in reality. But be as it may, it was a very interesting time to hear the great notions that were being displayed and discussed and pledged, ironically, by countries that perhaps aren't so willing to make those same pledges directly and forcibly with consequences to their own electorate.
Okay, well, let's start with some of the main takeaways from the climate conference. What did you feel were these main takeaways?
Well, I think the confab really struggled to maintain what it had achieved at Paris in 2016, so 5 years ago. And it would appear that the same kind of routine, you've mentioned you've been to these before. I've seen many of these before, going back to my days as a parliamentarian, back to Kyoto in 1997. It seems that we tend to go through this whole process of explaining there's a problem, coming out with hyperbole about, if we don't do something, the world is going to come to an end as we understand it. Then, of course, all sorts of ideas that have countries saying, yeah, we might commit to something. Then, of course, going right to the wire as they did, and then saying, this is not going to work. And then the last second, going after the 2 weeks, they finally come up with some kind of a decision, a statement, which everybody can agree to. In the end, it probably doesn't have or hold much value, save and except for countries that have already experienced some of the punishing effects. And I think here of UK and Germany, of what has been proposed in the past. So once these things start to roll out and people get a better understanding of what's involved, I think they have a very different approach. One of the takeaways for me, though, is even the signatories. I mean, we know China, Russia, we know Australia, we know India make these pledges, but are of course saying so, with the fingers tied behind their backs, crossed as they are, saying, this is nice to say these things. We don't want to make an international embarrassment of ourselves. But realistically, none of them are going to be able to achieve the lofty goals that they're suggesting, and certainly not without substantial, drawbacks in the advancement of their societies. So I think for a lot of people, a lot of good, heartfelt stuff, but most of it, I think, when it's actually subject to the acid test of reality, fails miserably on both sides, by the way.
Right.
So for us, those of us saying we're going too far, to those who are saying you haven't gone far enough, I think everybody's going to walk away with it saying, that was a 2-week event. It's behind us. It won't be news in the next 3 or 4 weeks, except for those countries that decide to impose it on their own.
We only have 30 seconds before commercial, but what were players like China up to at this conference?
Yeah, China's always very quick at pointing out the great things that they're doing, that they're going to be reducing their coal production in other parts of the world as a means of reducing their carbon footprint. But at the same time, not really coming out and making any displays about the fact that, well, I mean, they're going to be increasing coal production, aren't they? And
Yes.
there are
Okay, I'm
many
going
other
to pause you
nations.
there. We got to cut to commercial. We'll be right back.
Yeah.
Welcome back. We're discussing COP26 or COP26, the climate change conference that just wrapped up in Glasgow. Joining me again is Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. So Dan, we were discussing some of the general takeaways from the conference, and we're going to narrow down to the more specific key agreements, if you will. But we talked about China and their role in the conference. There was a lot of humming and hawing from groups like Russia. What would their contribution? Is it actually a serious contribution? India, again, making this large declaration that they're going to phase out or pledging carbon neutrality, which maybe you should explain what that is, by 2070. That's a long way off. Do they hold any teeth, any of these agreements?
Well, I don't think they hold teeth, but I think one has to realize that demographics make it impossible for them to achieve anything within the bounds of time. Look, China is losing ground in terms of the population growth. This is not news. When I worked in foreign affairs and visited China, it was always well known that China was fighting against itself. Its population is dropping. India's is increasing. It's that population issue that continues to be a very, very big factor, not just in terms of achieving goals, but recognizing that as the population of the Earth continues to increase, the planet, the emissions will continue to rise. And so, how do you tell a country, "Hey, stop it! You got to, put the brakes on here"? And so, the whole idea of carbon neutrality being, if you produce emissions, you find a way to abate it somehow, some way, somewhere. For technology, frankly, Tanya, that doesn't exist yet.
Right. Okay, let's move on to some more of this more specific. So there was a deforestation pledge, basically to end deforestation by 2030. 133 nations, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they signed on to this agreement. Does this kind of pledge, and I'm going to assume Canada signed in on this, although I don't know if we have large deforestation issues, will this harm Canada's natural resource sectors in terms of our lumber production, et cetera?
Well, I think the irony in all this is, if I listen to climate crusaders, well known like Bill McKibben and 360, one of the things or 350, I should say, one of the things you often hear from them is one of the cleanest forms of energy production that is renewable is in fact cutting down trees, biomass. So I'm not sure how this pledge syncs with those out there, the climateers who believe that cutting down trees because it's a renewable form of energy to be burned can somehow now be squared with this pledge. I think the idea of deforestation is not new. Morris Strong here in Canada used to do it years ago in 1992. Ontario Hydro bought tens of millions of acres of Brazilian rainforest. I think the concept needs to be better understood in the context of what many of the green proponents are saying is that, hey, it's okay to cut down forests, not just for making windmill farms, but also cut down forests to make renewable energy.
Yes, those windmill farms really do take down a lot of trees, don't they? To be renewable, you got to really cut a lot of trees down. Anyhow, okay, so, I come from a rural part of Ontario. That's where I live. A lot of people heat their home with wood. So your point is not lost on me that it's a renewable resources and people feel that it's a cleaner way to go. A lot of people don't have pipelines to their homes in the less urban areas of Canada. However, now we have this pledge or this goal. They said they're going to phase down. They so initially said phase out, but I think the ultimate agreed upon language was phase down coal and fossil fuels. Okay, so how will phasing down of coal and fossil fuels hinder Canada's natural gas sector and oil and gas sector, rather?
Well, we still extract coal, we still produce coal, we still export coal. So obviously there's going to be a consideration there. Remember, look, the argument aside, the most efficient form of per unit energy is found in coal, more than any other type of product that we know, other than uranium. And that, of course, requires, but from a natural perspective, coal is certainly there. And I don't see in any way, shape, or form any success on that front when you have countries saying, if you look at the level of coal consumption, it rose and now it's plateaued, but there's no indication of it going down. In fact, the energy crisis that we're currently seeing has demonstrated an even greater need for coal as there is less natural gas and other viable alternatives. Canada, by the way, as we know, could be an alternative, but it spends too much of its time placating protesters who block our pipelines so that we can get natural gas to our LNG facilities to get into that part of the world. But I digress. I think for most, the idea is more wishful thinking, I think, for now, until we actually get technologies that can displace. And I don't see that on the horizon. I don't see it anytime in the next 10. I don't see it in the next 50. I don't see it in the next 100 years.
Right.
I'm not a predictor of these things, but show me the evidence. And I think it's pretty clear that it's not coming anytime soon.
I always wonder, and we've got to cut to commercial, so we'll pick this up after, but I always wonder if with these conferences, is Canada just really just undercutting its position to be a global oil and gas producer? We'll debate that, but we're going to be right back in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're unpacking the latest climate change conference sponsored by the UN that just wrapped up in Glasgow, and joining me again is Dan McTeague. Dan, carbon credits, I feel this is part of our nomenclature now. There's now a new framework in which countries can now trade or share carbon credits. How does this work?
Well, look, as it stands, these are known as trade-offs, or if you will, these are ways in which companies can continue to produce products that emit carbon dioxide, CO2, and purchase from someone who doesn't or has technology that doesn't, as it were, to be able to compensate and offset, if you will, the amount of emissions that you're producing. So if I'm a refiner and I produce X amount of carbons, I'm capped a certain amount. In order to be under that cap, I just buy from someone who actually has these carbon credits. The problem is that these carbon credits are extraordinarily expensive. 4 years ago, $125 for a carbon credit. Today, $475. And that's driving up the price of things like, we can talk about that later, the clean fuel standard, which is now about 16 or 17 cents a liter versus the promised 2 or 3.
Wow. And correct me again if I'm offside here, but when I thought of this concept, and you've explained it very well, of trading these carbon credits, to me, this seems like a cop-out for actually, if the intention is to actually reduce carbon emissions, if you're just sharing it with someone who produces none and basically trading off credits, and you're paying more, it's a tax really, how does that help achieve what I assume is the perceived goal of actually reducing carbon emissions?
Well, the idea is to make prices so expensive that no one will want to use or be able to purchase the product with the attached carbon credit price attached to it. And by the way, there aren't very many nations that have a carbon tax, and on top of that, a carbon credit regime, let alone mandates on reduction of carbon in fuel. It does amount to, unfortunately, and we're seeing this not just for fuel, we're seeing it now in rearing its ugly head in food prices. This is demand destruction, economics 101.
And explain what that is, demand destruction, for our viewers.
So you make it the price of everything that you would otherwise take for granted, things that you need, whether or not you have to live by the heating for your home, gas to get you to your work, products that use fossil fuels, such as pretty much everything, plastics, car products, etc., made from fossil fuels. The price becomes so high that it becomes effectively prohibitive, and you cause demand to drop, except that there's something called an elasticity of demand, where people have no choice. They need to eat or they need to stay warm in a country like ours, especially as we're coming into a colder season like now. So its effects are far worse than the benefits they seek. In other words, the cost is much higher than the benefits, and it destroys demand. It also, as a consequence, destroys the economy of the country.
Now, for companies where they're flush with cash, or, large corporations, maybe they could afford these kind of carbon taxations. But a lot of this sounds like it gets trickled down to the end user, the consumer.
Be very careful on this, Tanya, because everybody comes out and says, well, these companies are all on board. The oil companies love doing this. Look, Cenovus, Suncor, Exxon, Imperial. Yeah, they do, because they can pass it on to the yob at the other end. That's you and I. And so what it's doing is just hammering the consumer, and it's making life unaffordable, miserable, and nasty for just about everybody that's out there. And if governments don't realize what that does, It's effectively taking a significant amount of revenue generation and disposable income and basically constraining it. And I think at the end of all of this, making the country not only impoverished, from my political years of experience, potentially creating massive tensions of the likes of which you've never seen in the Canadian Federation.
Well, absolutely. And I think it can amount to even a class war because, the middle and the lower class or income earners in Canada are the ones who are really going to be targeted the most. If you're a billionaire, so you have to pay an extra few cents a liter at the pump, you're not going to care. And this kind of leads me to my next point. A lot of some spectators for COP26, including Greta Thunberg to some degree, have called out what they saw was a lot of hypocrisy at this conference.
Yes.
You had Joe Biden roaring into the G20 meetings in Italy beforehand with an 85-car motorcade in Rome. You see limos idling up and down the streets in Glasgow. There were more private jets coming in and out of Glasgow airport than one could care to count. We only have 30 seconds, but was there, and we'll continue this after the break, but was there a lot of climate hypocrisy here at Glasgow?
Absolutely, led by Canada with the most number of delegates. And they didn't exactly swim across the Atlantic to get there.
Wow, how many delegates did we send?
277 plus 17 press attaches. And that's the only ones we know. Goodness knows who paid for it, but I can guarantee you it wasn't out of the goodness of their own souls and pockets.
My goodness, sort of all the world, Canada sent the most climate change delegates. Okay, lots going on. I want to talk more about that hypocrisy, though, right in a few short moments. We are wrapping up our discussion on the synopsis and the takeaways from COP26, the climate change conference that was recently resolved in Glasgow. Dan, again, thank you so much for joining me. Before the break, I was highlighting what many in the media even perceived as a hypocrisy among a lot of these climate change delegations, these countries who've participated with their, many, many private jets, massive motorcades and whatnot. I read a study that suggested that the richest 1%, I'm going to read it, richest 1% of the world's population were responsible for more than twice as much carbon pollution as the 3.1 billion people who made up the poorest half of humanity. So what I see, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe I am, and I'd love the challenge. We have a group of elites that gather in a room, or in many rooms in Glasgow, who are basically declaring and dictating the environmental policies of the world, which are going to have the biggest impact on the lowest, poorest nations of the world. How is this fair?
Well, it's not just unfair. The fact is it's contemptuous, and it demonstrates once again that these kind of policies are great for the rarefied groups that meet, swill back Perriers and eat canapes while discussing how they're going to chop up the world. But it's not by accident that the large number of developing nations have basically said this is a nice conference, thank you, but if you're not going to give us a couple $1 trillion, we're not in it. So don't ask us to do things that you've already been able to do. And if you guys are responsible for this stuff, clean up your own mess before you come to us. And now, we all recognize the planet is one. And I think for a lot of people, we have to also know that the technologies that we can share are very important. And that's, of course, where the Canadian position completely and utterly fails. Rather than saying Canada is a solution in terms of providing clean energy to the rest of the world, we demonize our own fossil fuels like natural gas. We actually bend over and placate and pay for and subsidize organizations to go and block pipelines in this country. To me, it seems that there's something seriously out of whack. And if one had to put a capital H on any country, apart from the fact the number of delegates that we sent, which I think was preposterously high, Canada really gets the in my view anyways, gets the prize for the biggest hypocrite there. And for that reason, a lot of countries scratching their heads saying, why would Canada do that to itself? A nation that has the ability, one that we respect, one that is known for its clean products. So overall, I think the elites have lost and failed here. But this is let's be blunt. This is what Carl Schwab and the WF wants. They want the rest of us to suffer, none of us to grow. And at the end of the day, I hate to say it, a lot of them do believe that the issue is population. It's not about a particular noble agenda.
Well, and the equality is really, really important to highlight. That's why I brought it up. Poor nations, we know, can't develop without the use of fossil fuels. And they can't develop wealth like the Western world. And here we're almost crippling them and saying, okay, well, you're now going to get with this agenda, which is so far out of reach for them. So I appreciate that there was some pushback from these developing nations saying, hey, we're like, as you said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to buy into this agenda if you're not going to subsidize it because we can't afford it. We're poor.
Yeah. And the only thing we're using for us is the extraction of your minerals, so you can make your lithium, your graphite, your cobalt by destroying not only our environment but having absolutely nothing in the way of any decent labor mandates. I think for many countries, and I've visited some of those countries in my time in foreign affairs as a member of parliament, where people are still using dung to heat their homes or to eat. To me, it suggests just how out of proportion and just how out of touch our international elites who confer every year, every 5 years on these things really are with humanity. And for that reason, let COP26, as I said earlier, thankfully it'll be forgotten in a few weeks. Let's get on with the business of ensuring that everybody in this world has an advantage and that we live and continue to prosper in this country.
Okay, 20 seconds before we have to go. What do any of these things mean for Canadians, for the consumer? Are we expecting more increase in carbon taxation?
Well, your government has tripled down on carbon taxes. It's bringing in the clean fuel standard. Now wants to just demonize only one industry, the natural gas and oil sector. It's not talking aviation in Montreal. It's not talking in manufacturing sector in Ontario. It's gone after only one sector. This is going to pinch the government's revenues, and it's also going to create tensions on a scale that I've not seen. It's certainly witnessed in the many years in which I followed politics. So congratulations, but our virtue signalers went to Glasgow and came back with even more reasons for the country to be less certain about its future, thanks to the shenanigans that went on there and the nonsense in order to pontificate as they did, both Trudeau and his 276 other members of his entourage.
Okay, Dan McTeague, always a pleasure.
Good to be here. Thanks, Tanya.
Of course, we all want to make it better. We want to make the world a better place. But if Canada's supposed to be charged with leading the way, and yet it sounds like there was a lot of climate change hypocrisy here at the COP26, then what does that mean for us, the Canadians on the ground who have to pay for it all? For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.